My brother stole my inheritance after I covered his bills when our parents abandoned and cut contact completely forever. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and this story starts the moment my parents decided I was old enough to stop being their responsibility, even though I was barely an adult and had no safety net. I still remember standing in our kitchen at 19, the smell of burnt coffee in the air, my dad saying, "You're smart. You'll figure it out," like that sentence magically replaced rent, food, and emotional support. My brother was sitting at the table scrolling on his phone, calm and untouched, because none of this applied to him. He stayed. I was pushed out. They didn't call it abandonment. They called it tough love. They said struggle would build character, while quietly continuing to pay my brother's bills, letting him live at home, and checking in on his feelings whenever he seemed stressed. When I asked for help, my mom sighed and said, "We can't baby you forever." When he asked, they listened. So I learned how to survive fast. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, stacking night shifts with early mornings, sleeping in my car when rent fell behind. I remember eating instant noodles on the floor of my first apartment, listening to the radiator knock like it was mocking me, and texting my parents that I was doing great because admitting the truth felt like failure. I smiled through holidays, showed up exhausted, and pretended independence didn't hurt. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the silence. The way no one checked if I was okay. The way my brother would casually mention new clothes or paid off tuition while I calculated whether I could afford gas that week. Still, I told myself this was just how families worked sometimes. Someone had to be strong. And even after everything, I held on to one belief like a lifeline, that family loyalty still mattered. That even if my parents failed me, my brother wouldn't. That at the end of all this survival, there would be fairness waiting for me. I didn't know yet how wrong that belief was about to be. By the time I was 21, the gap between my brother's life and mine felt impossible to ignore, even though everyone acted like it didn't exist. He still lived at home, his room untouched since high school, his laundry magically done, meals appearing without effort. Meanwhile, I was timing my showers so I wouldn't push the electric bill too high, standing in grocery aisles doing mental math, deciding which meals I could afford to skip. When I mentioned being tired, my mom laughed lightly and said, "That's adulthood." When my brother complained about stress, she sat beside him and rubbed his back. What made it worse was how normal they made it sound. My dad would call and say things like, "We're so proud of how independent you are," like independence wasn't something they forced on me at gunpoint. Then, in the same conversation, he'd casually mention helping my brother with a car payment or covering a semester because he's just not ready yet. Every word felt like a reminder that readiness was something they decided, not earned. I tried talking to my brother once. We were sitting in his car, the leather seats warm, music low. I told him, quietly, "Sometimes it feels like I was cut loose while you were protected." He shrugged and said, "That's not my fault. You're just better at handling things." He said it like a compliment. It felt like a verdict. So I stopped bringing it up. I worked more. I slept less. I convinced myself resentment was weakness and loyalty meant swallowing discomfort. Holidays became performances. I'd show up with dark circles under my eyes, joke about being busy, and watch my parents dote on him without realizing how sharp every moment felt. The house smelled like familiar food I couldn't afford, and it reminded me of everything I lost by being strong. Still, I believed this imbalance had an expiration date. That one day my parents would look at everything I'd survived and finally say, "We should have helped you too." I told myself my brother would stand up for me if it ever mattered. I didn't realize that silence was already a choice, and it wasn't mine. By 23, my body was surviving, but my mind was constantly on edge, like I was waiting for something bad to happen because nothing ever felt secure. I lived paycheck to paycheck with no backup plan, no one to call if something went wrong. When my car broke down one winter, I sat in the driver's seat gripping the steering wheel, watching my breath fog the windshield, realizing I couldn't afford the repair and still make rent. I called my parents anyway, even though every instinct told me not to. My dad answered, distracted. I explained the situation, my voice tight, and there was a pause before he said, "That's rough, son, but you always land on your feet." Then he added, almost casually, "We just helped your brother with his car last month. Things are tight." Tight for them still meant help for him. For me, it meant encouragement. I hung up and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because crying felt useless. I borrowed money from a coworker I barely knew and worked double shifts to pay him back. That night, I scrolled through social media and saw my brother post pictures from a weekend trip my parents had funded. The caption said, "Family time." I stared at it until my phone screen dimmed. When I confronted my mom later, her voice sharpened. "We didn't abandon you," she said. "We trusted you. Don't twist this into something ugly." Ugly. That word stuck. Like my pain was an inconvenience, something embarrassing she wanted smoothed over. I started wondering if my parents saw my struggles at all, or if my silence made it easier to pretend I didn't need them. I'd been praised for being strong for so long that weakness felt like betrayal. Every time I thought about asking for help, I heard my brother's voice, "You're just better at handling things." That was when it hit me, strength wasn't something they admired. It was something they used to justify doing nothing. And the worst part was realizing I'd helped build this narrative myself, a narrative that was about to cost me far more than money. By 25, I stopped expecting help, but I hadn't stopped expecting honesty. I told myself I didn't need money or favors anymore, I just needed the truth. So when my parents invited me over for dinner one night, I thought maybe something had shifted. The house looked the same, smelled the same, like time hadn't moved at all. My brother was there too, relaxed, joking, completely at home. I felt like a guest who'd overstayed a lifetime. After dinner, while my mom cleared plates, my dad started talking about the future. Retirement. Downsizing. Planning ahead. My stomach tightened. I asked, carefully, "What does that mean for things, long term?" He knew exactly what I meant. Inheritance. Support. Fairness. The room went quiet. My mom waved her hand dismissively. "We don't like talking about money like that," she said. "It creates tension." I almost laughed at the irony. Tension had been my permanent state for years. I pushed anyway, my voice calm but shaking. "I just want to know we're being treated equally." That's when my brother finally looked up from his phone. "Why are you making this weird?" he said. "You're doing fine. You don't need anything." My dad nodded, relieved to agree. "Exactly. You're established. Your brother still needs guidance." Established. I was exhausted, one emergency away from collapse, but in their eyes, survival looked like success. I tried explaining that independence didn't mean I hadn't struggled, that being quiet didn't mean I hadn't needed them. My mom's expression hardened. "We won't apologize for raising you right." The conversation ended there. No resolution. No reassurance. Just an unspoken rule that fairness was a word I wasn't allowed to say out loud. As I drove home that night, streetlights blurring through the windshield, something heavy settled in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was the slow realization that my role in this family was fixed, and questioning it only made me the problem. Still, I clung to one last hope, that when it truly mattered, when things were written down instead of spoken, the truth would finally come out. I didn't know that moment was already approaching, and it would break whatever loyalty I had left. The truth didn't come out during a fight or some dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, folded into an envelope my parents left on the counter like it was nothing. I was visiting to pick up an old box of documents they'd stored for me, and my mom casually said, "Oh, don't read anything that's not yours." The way she said it, too fast, too practiced, made my chest tighten. I didn't mean to snoop. I swear that. But when I saw my name printed next to my brother's on a legal-looking document, something in me froze. It was an estate planning summary. Not the full will, just enough to outline intentions. Percentages. Assets. Responsibilities. I read it once, then again, my hands starting to shake. My brother was getting the house. Most of the savings. Ongoing financial support until fully settled. I was listed as independent, with a smaller one-time amount, justified by a note that said I had already proven self-sufficiency. Proven.
like my suffering was a resume.
When I confronted them, my dad didn't even look surprised. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and said, "We knew you'd take this personally."
My mom added, "This isn't a punishment. It's practical." Practical. As if fairness was an inconvenience they'd optimized away. I asked the question that had been burning me alive for years. So all that struggling, that was just assumed into the plan?
My brother stood there silent, eyes on the floor, not defending me, not denying it either.
Finally, he muttered, "I didn't ask for this." But he didn't refuse it. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a fault line giving way after too much pressure.
Every late shift, every skipped meal, every time I swallowed my pride and said I was fine, it had all been used as evidence against me. As I drove home that night, the city felt distant, unreal.
I realized I hadn't just been abandoned back then. I'd been categorized. Reduced. Decided. And the worst part was knowing this wasn't the end of it. It was just the middle. After that night, something in me went quiet. Not healed, numb. I stopped calling my parents. Stopped initiating texts.
I told myself I needed space to think, but the truth was darker than that.
I didn't trust my own emotions anymore. Every memory felt rewritten.
Every sacrifice felt stupid. I kept replaying my mom's voice saying practical like it explained everything.
Life didn't pause just because I was unraveling. Bills still came. Work still demanded energy I didn't have. I started missing meals again, not because I couldn't afford food this time, but because eating felt pointless. Some nights I'd sit on my bed in the dark, fully dressed, listening to the hum of traffic outside, wondering how I'd become this invisible to the people who raised me. The breaking point came quietly. My boss pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if I was okay. I laughed and said, "Yeah, just tired." He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You've been tired for years." That sentence hit harder than anything my parents had ever said. A stranger had noticed what my own family never had. I called my brother that night. Not to argue. Not to accuse. Just to ask, "Did you ever think this wasn't fair?" There was a long pause before he said, "I didn't want to rock the boat." That was it. That was the loyalty I'd believed in. Silence, chosen because it was easier. After the call, I slid down the wall of my apartment and sat on the floor, knees pulled to my chest, breathing like I'd run a marathon. For the first time, I admitted it out loud to an empty room, "They don't care if I survive. They just care that I don't complain." That was my rock bottom. Not losing money. Not losing support. Losing the illusion that I mattered to them in the same way. And once that illusion shattered, I started thinking about something I'd never allowed myself to consider before: what my life would look like without them at all. For weeks after that realization, I moved through my days like I was underwater. Everything sounded muffled. Conversations felt distant. I still went to work, still paid my bills, still answered emails, but something fundamental had shifted. I stopped imagining future holidays at my parents' house. Stopped picturing my brother and me growing closer with time. Those images used to keep me going. Now they felt like scenes from someone else's life. My parents eventually noticed my silence. My mom texted, "Are you upset with us?" like this was a temporary mood, not a lifetime of damage. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, "I'm just busy." The same lie I'd used for years. The difference was, this time, I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting myself. When my dad finally called, his tone was irritated, not concerned. "You don't just disappear from family," he said. I almost laughed. Disappearing was the only thing I'd ever been allowed to do. I asked him, calmly, "Can you honestly say you treated us the same?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Life isn't equal. You know that." The call ended shortly after. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and started writing things down. Not accusations. Facts. What I'd given. What I'd received. What I kept hoping would change. Seeing it on paper made it impossible to ignore. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was clear. I realized something uncomfortable but freeing: family loyalty had only ever flowed one way. Mine. And I'd been bleeding myself dry to keep people comfortable who never planned to meet me halfway. So I made a quiet decision. No announcements. No dramatic cutoffs. Just boundaries. Distance. I stopped reaching out. Stopped explaining myself. I let the silence exist and waited to see who would step into it. Days passed. Then weeks. No one did. And in that empty space, something unexpected started to grow, something that felt less like grief and more like resolve. Because once you accept you were never truly chosen, you start asking a dangerous question. What would happen if, for once, you chose yourself? Choosing myself didn't feel empowering at first. It felt wrong, like I was breaking an unspoken rule that had governed my entire life. For years, my worth had been measured by how much I could endure without asking for anything back. Now, without my parents' expectations or my brother's shadow, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. The silence I'd created wasn't peaceful yet. It was loud, uncomfortable, and full of doubt. I started small. I stopped overworking just to prove something no one was watching. I said no to extra shifts. I spent a little money on things that made my apartment feel like a home instead of a holding cell: a decent lamp, real food, a chair that didn't wobble. Each choice felt strangely rebellious. I kept waiting for guilt to swallow me whole. It didn't. Instead, something else crept in: relief. One night, I ran into an old family friend at a grocery store. She asked how my parents were doing, then added, "They must be so proud of both of you." The old version of me would have smiled and agreed. This time, my chest tightened, and I just said, "We're not very close anymore." Saying it out loud felt like ripping off a scab. It stung, but it was honest. Word must have gotten back to my parents, because my mom called a few days later, her voice wounded. "Why are you telling people we're distant?" she asked. Not "why are you hurt," not "what did we do?" Just concern for how things looked. I realized then that silence hadn't scared them. Image had. After that call, I stopped waiting for an apology. I stopped hoping my brother would suddenly understand. I saw the pattern clearly now: discomfort made them defensive, not reflective. My pain wasn't a problem to solve, it was something to manage quietly. And as that truth settled in, I felt something shift. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done chasing fairness from people who benefited from imbalance. But just as I started building a life that didn't revolve around them, something happened that pulled me right back in: one final reminder that my role in this family wasn't over yet. Not unless I made it end. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of work. I almost didn't answer. The number was familiar, and my body reacted before my brain did: tight chest, shallow breath, that old reflex to brace myself. I told myself I was different now. Stronger in a way that didn't require silence. So I stepped outside and picked up. My mom's voice was rushed, strained. "We need you," she said, skipping every pleasantry. My parents were having financial issues. Not an emergency, she clarified quickly, but things were complicated. She talked in circles, never using numbers, never saying how bad it was. Then came the line I'd heard my whole life: "You're the responsible one." I asked the question I'd learned to ask now. Where's my brother in all this? There was a pause. She said, "He's dealing with a lot emotionally right now." Of course he was. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They weren't calling because they had no options. They were calling because I was the option that didn't push back. I told her I needed time to think. She didn't like that. "Family doesn't think about helping," she snapped. "They just do." The old guilt tried to claw its way back in, whispering that saying no made me selfish, ungrateful, cruel. I leaned against the brick wall behind me and closed my eyes. For the first time, I answered honestly. "I spent years surviving alone," I said. I can't be your backup plan anymore.
Her voice hardened instantly.
After everything we've done for you? The rewrite.
The erasure.
The call ended soon after.
I stood there for a long time, phone heavy in my hand, realizing this was the real test.
Not walking away in anger. Walking away without being chased. Without being chosen.
That night, my brother texted, "Mom's really upset.
You should help." No apology. No acknowledgement. Just expectation. I didn't reply.
And in that silence, I understood something painful and final. The moment I stopped being useful, I stopped being family.
What I did next would decide whether that pattern ended with me or followed me forever.
I didn't sleep much after that.
My phone stayed face down on the nightstand like it might burn me if I touched it.
Every instinct I had was screaming to fix things, to smooth it over, to send money just to make the tension stop.
That instinct had kept me trapped my entire life.
This time, I forced myself to sit with the discomfort instead of running from it. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail from my dad. His voice was calm in a way that felt rehearsed.
"We're disappointed," he said.
"This isn't how family treats each other."
No mention of the years I'd struggled alone.
No acknowledgement of the imbalance.
Just disappointment, like I'd failed a test they designed.
I called him back, hands shaking, heart pounding in my ears. I told him I wasn't giving them money. I said it plainly, without explaining myself. There was a long pause, and then his tone changed.
The warmth disappeared.
"So that's it?" he asked.
"After everything we sacrificed?" I almost laughed at that word. Sacrifice. I asked him to name one thing they'd sacrificed for me as an adult. He didn't answer.
Instead, he said something I'll never forget: "Your brother would never do this to us."
There it was. The comparison. The final confirmation.
I told him, quietly, then asked him.
He hung up on me. The fallout was immediate.
My mom sent texts about how I was tearing the family apart. My brother stopped messaging altogether.
The silence wasn't accidental anymore.
It was punishment. And for the first time, I didn't chase it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the same place I'd once eaten instant noodles on the floor, and felt something unexpected settle in.
Not guilt. Not fear. Relief. I hadn't been dramatic. I hadn't screamed or exposed anyone. I just said no, and that was enough to reveal everything I needed to know. I realized then that this wasn't just about money.
It was about control. About who was allowed to struggle and who was allowed to be saved. And by refusing to play my role one last time, I'd crossed a line there was no coming back from.
What came next wasn't reconciliation.
It was something far more permanent. After I said no, I waited. Not because I planned to give in, but because some small, stubborn part of me still expected a conversation.
An apology. Anything that sounded like reflection instead of blame. Days turned into weeks, and nothing came. No check-ins. No attempts to understand.
Just a quiet, coordinated absence that felt intentional. That was when the grief hit, not all at once, but in waves. I'd be fine at work, then suddenly feel hollow standing in line for coffee. I'd hear someone laugh in a way that reminded me of my mom, or see a car like my dad's in traffic, and my chest would tighten.
I wasn't mourning what I lost. I was mourning what I never actually had.
I started therapy around that time, mostly because I didn't trust myself to untangle it alone.
The therapist asked me a simple question that stopped me cold. When was the first time you remember being praised for surviving instead of being supported? I didn't have to think long. Childhood. Always childhood. I realized this pattern hadn't started when I moved out. It had just become visible then. One afternoon, I got a message from my brother. Just one line: "Mom's still hurt." No, I'm sorry. No, I should have spoken up.
I stared at it for a long time before replying, "So am I."
He never responded. That was the moment I let myself grieve properly. Not angrily. Not defensively. Honestly.
I cried for the younger version of me who believed love was earned through endurance.
I cried for the adult version who kept waiting to be chosen.
I cried because walking away didn't mean I didn't care, it meant I finally cared about myself enough to stop bleeding.
Grief is strange like that. It doesn't ask for permission. It just demands space.
And once I gave it that space, something else followed close behind, something that felt like acceptance, not of what they did, but of who they were never going to be.
The final step wasn't revenge. It was release.
I used to think closure would come with a confrontation, some dramatic moment where everything was finally said out loud and acknowledged.
But closure didn't arrive like that.
It came quietly, on an ordinary morning, when I realized I hadn't thought about my parents or my brother in days.
Not with anger. Not with longing. Just absence.
I woke up, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. The light hit the buildings the same way it always had, but something inside me felt lighter, steadier. For the first time, my life wasn't shaped around what I needed to survive or who I needed to be for someone else.
It was just mine. I sent one final message to my parents. Not to accuse or explain. Just the truth, I'm stepping back from this relationship. I wish you well, but I need to protect myself. I didn't wait for a response. I blocked the numbers. The quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. People talk about walking away like it's giving up. For me, it was choosing to stop repeating the same pain and calling it loyalty. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need them to admit anything. The power came from no longer needing their approval to feel whole. I still have scars. I still flinch sometimes when someone praises me for being strong. But now I understand what strength actually is. It's not surviving alone when you shouldn't have to. It's knowing when to leave a place that keeps asking you to disappear.
I built a life where no one has to earn my care by suffering. Where love doesn't come with conditions.
Where silence isn't punishment, it's a boundary.
And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the family you come from can wound you deeply, but the family you choose, starting with yourself, can heal you in ways you never thought possible.
I didn't lose my family. I found myself.